It's great to be here, and thank you very much. If you see me limping around, it's not a permanent condition. It's because yesterday I played a very fierce game of road hockey with my 5-year-old grandson, Alistair. And he won 10-7, which is about the right score for a 5-year-old. And at the end, he assured me seriously that he was going to become a hockey professional and play in the NHL. And I, with my background of trying to introduce a dose of realism without shooting down authors' hopes, said that, well, that might be a little tricky since there were so many hockey players trying to get into the NHL. And he shot this down by saying, but there are so many NHL teams. What I'm going to do today is a little unusual. My book, as you can see, is called Stories About Storytellers. And to help promote it, I have devised a traveling stage show with the title Stories About Storytellers. And I've taken this show, which comes in either a 60 or a 65-minute or a 90-minute version, right across the country. And I'm happy to tell you that this August it's going to include Haida Gwaii, as well as Saskatchewan, etc., etc. So we're not going to do that here, but we'll do an interesting version where I will take you through the 21 authors who are the center of my book. Each chapter is a miniature biography. And we'll just whiz through, and then at the end I will say, okay, who do you want to hear stories about? Okay? So we'll just whiz through. And we're going to do it with the aid of a very, all right, we're going to do it, a very dangerous man. This is Tony Jenkins of the caricature was done by Tony Jenkins, who's the Globe and Mail's caricaturist. And he's very dangerous because when he does a not very flattering portrait of you, day by day by day, you grow to look more and more like the damn portrait. And I'm a good sport. I even wear the striped tie. So here we go. Stephen Leacock, professor, humorist, and immigration agent. I describe him as the man who brought me, a kid growing up in a small Scottish village, to Canada to work with Canadian authors. It's a long story. And then the authors I worked with as their editor, and I'd stress that, I published thousands of authors over the years. The ones that follow are ones I worked with as their editor, working closely with them, okay? Very first author I came across in the slush pile at Doubleday Canada was this man, R.D. Simmons, cowboy, writer, artist, and conservationist. Harold Horwood, Newfoundlander, novelist, naturalist, and neglected genius. Barry Broadfoot, newspaper guy and oral historian. I'm sure many of you remember 10 Lost Years and 6 War Years and so on. Hugh MacLennan, teacher, novelist, essayist, and cottager, and I can explain that. Morley Callahan, novelist, short story writer, Torontonian, and if you read the Toronto Star, you know that Ernest Hemingway went a long way out of his way to encourage young Morley when he was starting out. Robertson Davies, whom I describe as man of letters, oracle, and ugly duckling. Jack Hodgins of Vancouver Island, islander, teacher, and inventor of worlds. James Houston, artist, author, hunter, and igloo dweller. One museum director said, no James Houston, no Inuit art. Charles Ritchie, diplomat, diarist, and charming dissembler. And I begin by saying he should have been a spy, and you see how well Tony Jenkins caught that with his caricature. Pierre Trudeau, you may have heard of, Prime Minister, author, and haunting icon. He haunts us still. Mavis Gallant, short story writer, Canadian and Parisienne. Peter C. Newman, refugee and power-seeking missile. Brian Mulroney, boy from Bay Como, and I think that's the key here, Prime Minister and author. Bob Hunter, Greenpeace founder, writer, and very merry man. Alistair MacLeod, teacher, fiction writer, stone carver, that refers to the pace of his creation, and dancer. Paul Martin, successful businessman, very successful finance minister and prime minister. Peter Zosky, writer and voice. Val Ross, journalist, author, and maker of rules. Alice Munro, not bad short story writer. And W.O. Mitchell, character and creator of characters. And then here's a composite of all of them, and I'll keep that up as I say, okay, who would you like to hear stories about? And I think we don't need to do the central mic. If you just stick up a hand and shout out a name. Yes? Peter Zosky. You know, my full show incorporates music, and when I get Peter Zosky up there, I play the Morningside theme. And people have come up to me and said, I was in tears when you played the Morningside theme. And I can see people are already, And that's because the program, Morningside, which ran, as you know, 3 hours, 9 till 12, 5 days a week throughout the broadcasting year, did an extraordinary service for Canada in general, because Canada was always the focus. He wasn't interested in interviewing American authors, say. It was always Canadian in focus. And he managed to join us together, and specifically, he paid great tribute and great attention to our writers. And I know that as a publisher then, I was the head of M&S during those years, and booksellers like Shelley would plead with us and say, can you tell us when Peter Zosky is going to be interviewing one of your authors? Because they knew that after a Morningside interview, there were going to be hundreds of books sold, thousands sold across the country. He was quite remarkable. And I would say the reason for that, the attention he paid, is that he was a writer. He described himself as a writer who worked on the radio, not as a radio star, not as an interviewer, a writer who worked on the radio. And I had the pleasure of working with him on a number of his own books, and he was a very, very fine writer. And one of the tragedies is that when the damn tobacco killed him, it deprived him and all of us from finishing the book that would have been remarkable, a book about Canada's North today. And I was at the celebration of his life at the Frontier College headquarters, which in Toronto is in Sinclair Avenue, and just looking down that hill towards the downtown towers. And there was a magical moment when the North came to him, because quite unexpectedly, Susan LeAucock stepped forward and sang Amazing Grace in Inuktitut. And we, looking south towards the Toronto towers, could see the clouds above them that seemed magically to be stretching all the way to the Arctic. He was a wonderful man, and we certainly miss Peter Zosky. Another hand, yes? Alistair MacLeod. Why do I describe him as a stone carver and a dancer? Let me do the dancer first. Well, let me tell you. You may be aware that Alistair is a somewhat slow writer, and you may be aware that to get the manuscript of No Great Mischief out of him, I had to do unforgivable things, including staging a raid on his Windsor house, which Alistair describes as a home invasion. And I knew that I would not be totally welcome, because on the phone he said, no, don't come, it's not ready to be picked up. But I showed up, and I was smart enough to, when I flew into Windsor to say to the cab driver, "Where is the nearest LCBO?" And he reacted very badly, thinking he had a real problem in the back seat who was going to throw up. But I went to get a bottle of Talisker. So when I knocked on the Curry Street house, Alistair came to the door in a very reserved fashion, and I had a bottle of Talisker to present as a peace offering. And then we went in and we chatted, and I knew Alistair and Anita for many years, and we were old friends. We chatted about our family and so on. But I was there. We didn't talk about the elephant in the room. I was this rude guy who had come to seize the manuscript, take it away from him. And I didn't comment on the fact that above the piano in the main room was the motto of the Clan MacLeod, and it's a terrifying motto. It is, "Hold fast." I didn't comment on this, but eventually I laid the publisher's contract on the table, and I said, "Now, this is for you, and it's the money we've talked about, and be careful because there's a check in there. Now, what have you got for me?" And Alistair rose and then came down the stairs with a manuscript, and I never let it out of my hands. It wasn't quite a finished manuscript because he was still working on the last maybe third, and he would send in batches of these handwritten pages, and people would fix it at our office. Anyway, when it all came about, No Great Mischief became wonderful success, a great classic, and it won the International Impact Prize. And that award was given out that year in Dublin. And all 6 of the MacLeod family children, and Anita and Alistair, were there, and I was there to attend the formal dinner. And the formal dinner was terrific. And then afterwards, we went out into the big drawing room, about the size of this room, with great gilded portraits of people wearing wigs all around the hall. But the Dublin organizers had done something terrific. They'd got the music for the party afterwards to be a bunch of young folk musicians playing Irish tunes. And Kenneth MacLeod, Alistair's 3rd son, is a professional fiddler. So Kenneth came along with his fiddle, and he introduced himself to the band, and he sat in with them, and that was great. The guy in the black tie in with all the kids in the blue jeans. And then after a bit, the band struck up a Cape Breton reel. And before you knew it, Alistair and the family had cleared a space in the center, and they hauled in Jane Urquhart to make up the female numbers, and they're dancing a Cape Breton reel. And the Irish black tie crowd are just delighted. They're clapping. I'm even contributing a few Scottish. And it was wonderful. And the English PR guy who runs this event each year said, in future years, people will say, "Well, this was a very pleasant evening. But those of us who were here tonight will say, but you should have been here the year the Canadians came." So that's Alistair MacLeod, the dancer. And I should tell you that when my wife and I visited him in Cape Breton last summer, but 2 summers ago, first evening we were there, he leant across the table and said, "Would you two like to come square dancing with us tonight?" So we went square dancing and we were pushed through, and it was just wonderful. So he's a dancer. Now, another hand. Yes, right here. Alice Munro. I mentioned Val Ross. And Val Ross, as a wonderful journalist dealing with books and authors for Maclean's and then the Globe and Mail, had a terrific story once in the Globe about how in Blythe, Ontario, home of the Blythe Festival, an American gentleman who was attending a chicken supper to raise funds for the festival stopped a waitress who was clearing the dirty dishes and said, that distinguished-looking woman over there, could she be perhaps the famous author who lives locally? And the hard-working waitress, with dishes piled high, with arms piled high with dishes, looked carefully and said, yes, I think it could be. And then Alice Munro, the waitress, picked up the dishes and went off to the kitchen. And that's Alice. Alice, hardworking, getting her hands dirty, helping out the local theatre, but with this wicked sense of humor. And my own proudest boast is that if I make it to the pearly gates and St. Peter is in a bad mood and says, "So, what have you ever done in your miserable, selfish life to deserve to get in here?" I can say, I kept Alice Munro writing short stories. And if St. Peter's English is any good, he'll say, "Holy smokes, Alice Munro, come on in." And my book gives proof of that, quoting a letter that Alice wrote when she wished to follow me when I left Macmillan to set up my imprint at McClelland and Stewart. And she said it was Doug when I was blocked, and when everyone else in publishing, incredibly, was saying, "You've got to stop this short story stuff, get serious, do the real thing, write novels." And I, in the country of the blind, I guess I was a one-eyed man, I said, you know, if you want to go on writing short stories for the rest of your life, I will go on publishing them. And we've done 13 together so far, and I'm happy to tell you that this fall there will be a new collection of Alice Munro stories called Dear Life. So there you go. Another name, and yes, over here. Morley Callahan. Yeah, Morley was, and in my stage show I actually knock out Ernest Hemingway right before your eyes. But Morley was always a tremendously feisty character, and I think, you know, he was trained as a lawyer here in Toronto, and but never practiced because he got a summer job with the Toronto Star, and Ernest Hemingway worked there, and Hemingway liked him, liked his writing, and encouraged him. And this meant that Morley, at the age of 25, was a published author, and he then went with his new wife to Paris to join the Scott Fitzgerald, Zelda Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway set that Woody Allen recently filmed, and I kept looking for Morley in the side of it. But Morley was always a feisty character. And the very first book I worked with him on was called A Fine and Private Place. And that's about a Toronto-based author who is world famous but unjustly neglected. And Morley had been singled out that way by Edmund Wilson, the great American critic, as one of the finest authors in the English language. So this is Morley's revenge on the Canadian literary establishment for ignoring him. And I was in the middle of this literary brawl, and it was very exciting. At the end of his life, towards the end, Alice Munro tells the story of how she was once on the Toronto subway. And she looked across, and there was Morley sitting there looking hunched and tired and old and ill. And Alice went over and reintroduced herself and found that it was true. Morley was indeed ill. In fact, he was going to visit his doctor. So Alice, being Alice with some consciousness of her own merits in the matter, stayed on a couple of extra stops to help the poor old man off the subway and up the stairs and then get him to the street. And she was taking his arm to help him across the street when the poor old man reared back and said, "You know what's the matter with your work, don't you?" And proceeded to tell her. That was Morley. Any other? Yes. The slush pile cowboy. Yes, I'm sorry. This is, I'm sorry, I should have begun with this. The slush pile cowboy, Bob Simmons. Remember, I'm fresh from Scotland and I'm working in downtown Toronto, and this manuscript is about a man, Bob Simmons, riding a horse north out of Fort St. John, way the hell north in northern BC, and surveying the land and staking a claim and going in with his family and felling the trees to build the cabin that becomes the center of a cattle ranch in defiance of the bears and the wolves. Just an amazing story. It was called The Broken Snare. But what I didn't know then was that there was a backstory, because Bob had to leave the ranch because he caught leukemia. And he retired to near Regina, beside Last Mountain Lake, Silton, Saskatchewan. And while he was there fighting leukemia, he was attacked by pneumonia, and the combination was just terrible. And they rushed him into Regina General, and after a few days, the doctors said to the family, "We're very sorry. We've done everything we can, but we don't believe he will last through the night." And a colleague of Bob's, who was then working at the Regina Natural History Museum as an artist, learned about this, and after midnight, he managed to sneak into the hospital, and he found Bob, the old cowboy, lying alone, just rolling sweat. But he was working on some pieces of paper. And he said, "Bob, what are you doing?" And Bob said, "I'm just checking the proofs of my book on prairie birds because I think I'm going to die tonight." And the friend said, "Boy, that's what I call a deadline." And they laughed, and they laughed, and they laughed, and Bob laughed himself right back to health. A couple of days later, they sent him home. He lived 8 more years, wrote half a dozen more books for me. So there's a deadline for it.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. Douglas, thank you so much.